is Ronnie. She is on the city council, and technically she is not a member of the board. It has been the board's wishes to have a city council member on the board historically. We seem to be very happy with our conversations with Mike when he was on the board and city council. But at this point in time, everybody needs to be reminded that Ronnie is technically not a member of the board. And Ronnie, I can't ask you to raise your hand if you have questions, but I will ask you if you have any questions appropriately at certain times. I hope that's okay with everyone here.
Sure.
Does that sound reasonable?
Yes.
And
Yeah, thanks.
does that sound reasonable, Ronnie?
She said thanks.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Sorry.
That's okay. And I'd just like to state at this point in time, it's kind of nice to be meeting face to face again. I know that it is somewhat easier at times to meet virtually because we don't have to attend somewhere. We can do it in the comfort of our own homes. But I also feel that there is more discussion at times when we meet personally. And it allows us also to actually work with some of our city counterparts. That being said, thanks for coming, everybody. Welcome to you. The second item on the agenda today is citizens to be heard. As there are no citizens other than Ronnie to be heard at this point in time, I'm going to move beyond that unless, Ronnie, you have anything to add at this point in time. I'll take that as a no. The next thing on the agenda is the approval of the minutes. Has everybody looked at the minutes?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any comments on the minutes?
They look fun.
I would move we approve them as written.
Second?
I have a motion to approve the minutes and a second. Is there any further discussion? Apparently not. All those in favor of approving the minutes as they are standing? Aye. Aye. That vote was unanimous. And the second thing we have on our agenda is the Water Resource Alliance and Water Now recommendations for landscaping regulations. Steve had some comments, and I think I emailed them to you, Cara. I may not have. That's fine. It was just a couple of comments. They weren't long and involved. No, we can review those in a second. And then, Cara, some of these landscaping regulations, I really feel like you're more of the expert on this board than anybody else. If you'd like to lead the discussion, I'd be willing to hand you that hat over to you. Why don't we start with Steve's comments?
Why don't we start with Steve's comments? Yeah, let's start with Steve's comments.
Okay.
Maybe I should take a step back first. Mila, let's take a step back first. So these were presented to the city, and they're not making any moves to have them done at this point in time or go in the direction of putting any of these ordinances into effect.
Oh, no, we're planning on hopefully doing that within the next month or so.
Within the
2
next
months.
month, so that's
Okay, well, that definitely adds some comments from me, but we still can start with Steve.
so.
And I have some questions that I would love, there's 3 questions, specific questions that I would love to get answered so that we have direction to give to the city council
Okay.
and from the water board. And then we're going to ask the same questions of the planning commission, and then we're going to go to the city council with the direction from the water board, direction from the planning commission, and then the city council will hopefully give us direction to then move forward with one of these
Okay.
approaches.
I'm going to ask another question. One of the things in the scope of work for the coalition was to look at landscaping ordinances across the valley. But it sounds like the time frame for the city will be in front of the time frame for that scope of work.
Yeah, well, I think that was something, I think that was on there because that's something that the city is already working on.
Okay. Then we talked about, well, we had discussed the fact whether or not we were going to try to make a recommendation, a formal recommendation to the city on these ordinances at this meeting. I was kind of under the impression that we would have a little more time than that, and that we were going to discuss it at this meeting and then make a formal recommendation at the May meeting.
Why don't we start by hearing, why don't we just have a discussion about it?
Discussion about it.
See
and
where
then
we end up.
See where we end up, that'd be fine.
'Cause-
Steve, do you want to go ahead? We're going to get to your questions in a second, in a moment here. Let's let Steve have some comments.
So just a general comment on the list of people that were consulted on this. It was a pretty narrow group of folks. I would think that you'd want to consult also folks that would be actually using these, like possibly a commercial builder, residential builder, maybe even somebody that's in the process or just completed building their own house, and ask them how the suggestions would affect their lot.
Yeah, unfortunately, we reached out to those people and we didn't get any replies.
Okay.
So it was attempted.
So Ben Bird and those folks never got back to you.
We had a conversation with a developer who has a plan in process, which was seemed like the perfect thing, and he was interested in chatting with us and then didn't follow up. So we are continuing to try that, but so far has been unsuccessful.
Okay, Steve, go ahead.
So on recommendation number 1, it seems like if we're trying to save water, increasing the amount of living plant material by quite a bit seems counterproductive. Then on number 2, just make sure the math of percentages add up to 100%. Number 3, turf limits. I think this is probably, in my mind, would be number 1 in recommendations to make. I wondered where the 200 square foot limit came from. Most communities that I've been reading the code sets a limit at 1,000 square feet or 10% of the lot, landscaped area, whichever is less.
Can I comment on that one?
Sure.
Because I marched off 200 square feet, that's 10 feet by 20 feet. I can't play ball with a child on grass. I can't play catch with that amount of.
It's very small, yes.
It's very, very small. I know there's a fair number of people out there that believe turf is one of our major water users, which indeed it is. And there's also a lot of turf out there that isn't used. But I completely agree with Steve that 1,000 or 10% seems to make a lot more sense for a family home at this point in time. Simply because of the fact I can't play catch on 200 square feet.
It'd be hard to water too.
Yeah.
It's actually really easy to water, but
The point being,
But-
the
it
other
is
thing
small.
I will say also is that although we know turf uses up way too much grass, there's also some science out there that states that turf also decreases the urban heating effect to some extent. It may not, in terms of water use and decrease of effect, it may not be the greatest strategy to decrease your urban heat effect. However, there are some positive reasons for climate and just enjoy and livability to have a certain amount of turf on your property if you so wished it. That's the point. There shouldn't be a requirement for turf, but if somebody wishes to have enough turf for their children to play on, I think that's not something we want to take away at this point in time.
And a lot of plans or a lot of codes are written such that the turf would be in the backyard and restrict all the use in the front and the side yards. Put it where it be usable.
Okay.
Anything more on that one?
I don't.
I've got some things, but I'm just gonna roll it all into when we get to what my thoughts are on this whole thing.
Suggestion 4 on the plant use, or the plant list. I would recommend using either suggested or recommended on that list. It'd be awful hard to maintain an up-to-date list of all the nurseries and things like that.
Actually, I disagree with that. Not that it would be hard to maintain a list, or I disagree with it being recommended or suggested being based on harder to maintain a list, because there's honestly, the list of plants that will do well here is not that big. So it actually would be pretty easy to maintain a list, but yeah, I have an overall comment that I'll get to that will touch on that also.
Yeah, I was just thinking if somebody orders something, from Burpees or something like that.
Yeah, and I think there's ways to deal with that. I think the more critical thing is, keep going.
On the water-wise plant requirements, number 5, I'm not sure how you would maintain this after the final approval of the house or whatever, a year later or something like that. How would you enforce this, and would you enforce it? So I was just wondering if well-designed tiered water rates would be a much more effective tool looking long-term into the future as people change their lots. Number 6, hydrozones. The existing standard seems pretty good to me. And number 7, the landscape budget. I'd like to see how that's done, and I went through the calculations and just don't, for somebody building their own place, how complex is that going to be for them to actually submit that along with their house plans, whatever. Number 8, mulch. Isn't that already covered by number 2, non-living ground cover? Wouldn't that be covered in the same? Number 9, I think the current code as written is pretty good. And number 10, on the Firewise landscape standards, I don't know if this is really needed here. And number 11, the maintenance, the I section in the explanation seems pretty good. I'll find it here in a second. So under current standards, section I, residential and commercial developments, I think that language is pretty good for the maintenance part of the landscape irrigation system. That's all I got.
Tim, before you go, Carl,
Yeah.
I was going to mention one thing that concerned me with this. I've been a proponent of gray water for quite some time. The last 2 weeks ago, I spent some time with the health department's tour of Arroyo Crossing and their issues with gray water at Arroyo Crossing and other places, and spoke with the health department and the geotech people at that, how we can make, at that tour about how we could make something work. And essentially, there's only three issues associated with gray water that kind of need to be solved. And one is whether there's room for it in yards, and the second is whether or not the soil is compatible with the gray water system, and then the third is compliance with the permitting process. And all of those are relatively easy from a building inspector's and a geotech's position to handle. It gets a little complicated, I imagine, for somebody who is building their own home, but for subdivisions, they have to have that geotechnical person on staff already, and that layout of the subdivision has to be there too. And theoretically, in a planned subdivision, this would not be a huge, it would not, essentially not be a lot of work either for the geotech or the designer of the subdivision. The compliance issue gets a little tricky, but if you were to just install it, which seems to be the way some of the people are going where it's possible, it adds less than $500 to $1,000 onto the cost of a home. And that by itself seems to be like it's not a lot of money in terms of affordable housing when you're looking at the cost of a home. And they don't have it here as any recommendation other than just to consider it. I'd like the city, at least if not in this attempt at providing some ordinances, at least when we're looking at the scope of work for the city and the county with the coalition, to take a more in-depth look at it and seeing if we can come up with something that seems amenable, because the builders didn't seem to bother them too much that were out there, and the geotechs didn't bother them. It seems to be more of a understanding between everybody that this can be done. It's just we have to do it. And at this point in time, I don't have any personal recommendations on how to handle gray water, other than the fact that I think it can be done from an ordinance standpoint and worked into the city building code. Okay, Cara, you ready?
So generally speaking, I really feel like leaping forward into changing ordinances or involving new ordinances is putting the cart before the horse, and we've been talking about this as a group almost since we got started. And we talked at length quite some time, many years ago, about the need for outreach and education prior to ordinances. And I feel really strongly that leaping into ordinances is not the way to go. That's my personal opinion. I also feel like it's kind of a slap at this body, because we've been talking about this for so many years of, gee, we really should have, and it'd be really easy. We had lengthy conversations with folks at the city level, city staff years ago, about what to make that look like, and it just never happened. So I feel like at minimum, it should, these any ordinances that are introduced should be done concurrent with a very robust outreach program, because I think that a lot of this could actually be solved in a better way that way, by providing people with the information they need to make really good decisions. And also that links to some of my thoughts related to some of what Steve was mentioning and some of the things in here in relation to whether or not you put a number, a maximum, amount of a certain kind of plant material, whether that's turf or whatever. I honestly think that is going to save less water than helping people learn how to water effectively and not overwater. The number of lawns I see in this town that are watered at least once a day, sometimes twice a day, is ridiculous. And getting some really solid understanding out there, helping people really understand that you can have a very healthy lawn. It will actually be more healthy when it uses less water, when it's watered deeply and infrequently. So that's kind of my overarching reaction to this. I also feel like, personally, from the perspective of someone who's installed a lot of landscapes, designed a lot of landscapes, that sort of thing, that the water budgeting concept coupled with hydrozones is probably the thing that will provide the most flexibility and creativity. Some of this other stuff doesn't matter then. Your size lawn, all those things, it doesn't matter if you do that stuff correctly. I think, though, that leads, because as Steve pointed out, you look at that and go, how do I do this? And so that, again, goes back to this concept of there needs to be proper outreach and education, because without that, no matter what you do, is not going to work well. And yeah, so I think the take home I have on this is if there's not outreach and education, all that's going to happen, I think, is a few people will really embrace some of this stuff. A lot of people will push back. I think also this is coming really fast. There's a number of people in the gardening community who are freaking out about this because there hasn't been outreach and education. It still comes back to that of, you know, helping people understand this is not saying you can't do things. This isn't really about limiting as much as it's about, as a community, getting smart and about how we use water. Which is why years ago we talked about the need for a really robust outreach program, because what it really comes down to is a change of the culture of how we use water, how we view water, and that can't be mandated via ordinance. That has to be, it has to evolve out of conversations and interactions. So
Adopted by the community?
yeah, and it's not, and saying, here, you will do it this way is not, in my opinion, the way to do that. But getting people talking about it and helping each other is more important. So that's kind of it's more blanket, you know, overall statements and not, I mean, I could sit here and nitty gritty through all of this, but I really feel like that's not very helpful. I do feel, you know, I was a little frustrated when I spoke with these folks, because almost every question that they had for me, it all came back to education and outreach, and they said, well, that's not what we've been tasked to do, or I forget how they put it, but it's like, well, okay, but that I think is the more critical need than actually having an ordinance. And also, if there's going to be a more regional effort to talk about landscape ordinances, I think it's more important that it be consistent for the region. You know, if we're talking Moab and Spanish Valley, so you've got city and county, if it's one set of rules and then you cross this line and it's suddenly a different set of rules or expectations, I don't think that's helpful. I think that just adds to the confusion and makes it feel more arbitrary and more confusing to people who live here. So that's what I've got on this.
So I'm going to remind us that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Mila, that this ordinances would be for new or redevelopment only, not for the current
Yeah.
people out there.
Yeah, it has no effect on any current.
Right.
And current
But
residents.
still, the fact that, I mean, you still need outreach and education about that. And honestly, if we really want to, if the goal is to save water, if the goal is to conserve water and change how, it needs to be more than on new construction. Because the amount of new construction is minuscule compared to the total amount of water being used in the community.
And that, I was going to say, is that if we wanted to change the current community's concept, it would be throughout reach and education and these ordinances, although something, at least from a planning perspective, I can see the city wanting new, especially commercial development, to fall within certain bounds. But if the majority of water used is by the citizens, and it is during the irrigation season, if we want to make a dent in water conservation, we need to get the community on board with this kind of change in thought on what you plant and where you plant it.
Just,
That being said, you want to comment at this point in time?
is it time for me? Or
Just
no?
about. Just a second. Ronnie, do you have any questions at this point in time?
No, I'm just, I'm trying to listen. I'm capturing most of it, so, thanks. I'm just focusing on listening.
Okay. And Amelia, you said you had 3 questions for us?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to be able to clear up some confusion that it sounds like there is too. So for one thing, yes, this is absolutely only new development. This doesn't have anything to do with current residents or current property owners or anything like that. So like, it does, you know, it's not, nobody is going to be affected other than new development. The second thing is the consultants have been tasked with coming up with the technical guidance for this ordinance. We are planning on doing a huge outreach and education component. That is not their job, that's our job. So that's what we are planning to do. And what we're really excited about is that we're going to be able to use their technical guidance and what we've come up with to inform our outreach and education for current property owners. So that's like part of this, is that this will inform all of the educational materials and outreach that we're going to be able to then, you know, be able to be writing about and doing with the community. The city is also planning on implementing a lot of this stuff as well. And that's going to be part of our outreach and education component. So like demonstrations, being able to actually show people what it looks like, on the ground versus like just having the paper guidelines. So that's a huge part of our plan. It just isn't within the scope of work of the consultants, that they're just doing the technical part. The other thing is that, I totally agree. I think it would be amazing if Grand County could also do this with us. We obviously have no control over what they do. So, unfortunately, they're interested in hearing about it and they want to work with us. But, unfortunately, we can't just coordinate that with them without their, full consent. So they're interested and we are keeping them informed, but we don't have any direct influence over that. And, I think like as far as we're talking about, all of these different aspects of water conservation, they're all in the plan, right? They're all part of their water conservation plan. It's a multi-pronged approach. And I don't necessarily think that the plan was to have, I know that the plan was definitely not to assume that the landscaping code and ordinances was in any way replacing or doing the bulk of the work or anything like that with water conservation. As far as our numbers, it's just one component and it was something that we could make happen. And then, there's been a lot of reaction to the way that some of the newer developments have, put in their landscaping, for instance, downtown. And I think, the general thought was the sooner that we can possibly get this on the books, we can require it. And we can't require developers to do anything that's not part of our code. And so if we can get something that is progressive and water-wise and in some way water conservation oriented into code as soon as possible, that means we can start requiring it for all new development. And until then, all we can do is ask. And so that was the motivation behind getting this to happen sooner rather than later, and then having the outreach and education component, basically happening concurrently and using some of the information that we're getting from these guidelines.
So could I make a comment or two?
Do you guys have any questions about that?
Well, I don't have any questions about that. Can I just a second? You had 3 questions
Yes.
for us. We haven't gotten
Yeah.
to those yet. Would you like to speak first?
Yes.
Yeah. So I would suggest that as far as getting the codes written, you may want to look at the scope of work from this coalition that's forming, because in their section 406D, which is covering conservation, land use ordinances, landscaping restrictions, they're going to be addressing this in that.
That's in there because of what we're working on.
Right, and that would be a coordinated effort between the 2 counties and the city. So it would seem like you could wait a few months to codify this, start your education program first, now. A lot of your existing standards, especially for commercial developments, are pretty good. The turf limit, I think, would be the only one that would really stand out as something that you'd really want to move on quickly. But it wouldn't make any sense to codify something now and then January of next year, when the coalition's starting to develop their standards, have to go back and change everything to conform to their vision of the entire valley under one set of codes.
And rather than, you guys are going to do what you're going to do. That's very obvious to me. I'll leave it at that. I may have missed something, missed a lot the last few months, but it has not been made clear to me before this moment that there actually was much of an effort that was really going to happen in regards to outreach and education. And so I think the messaging really, if this body or even just members of this body haven't caught that, that's important. The community needs to hear that. And they need to hear it sooner than later. They need to hear it before this hits a planning commission or a city council meeting agenda, because that's when people start to freak out and it turns into something that it may not be. So, and I think if what Steve mentioned on this coalition, if part of why they're putting the landscape ordinance ideas forward is because of what the city's doing, that's great. I do think, though, it's really messy, as Steve mentioned, to enact or codify things, enact new ordinances, change existing ordinances, whatever you're going to do, and then potentially less than 6 or 12 months later do it again. So I just think that's just something to be cognizant of.
I will add one thing to that. I personally understand the need for something on commercials development at this point in time, and it appears the city needs that sooner than later. And there are people who would like to build things, and you're hoping to get them to comply with water conservation stuff. You can see that coming, and it's coming within a year.
Right.
From my perspective, the major discussion here between these folks is if you move to the residential realm, if you stick with the commercial realm, it's not as big a deal to the entire community here as it is if you move to the residential realm. So from my perspective, I'm not speaking for these two, that if you were to codify something for the commercial people in the next little bit, whenever that time frame is, you wouldn't get objections from me. Okay? Okay, that's my take on this. You had 3 questions for us. Can you ask that?
Yeah, so the 3 questions that we need to know to be able to move forward would be, I mean, that's a great comment also, is separating out commercial and residential. So that's something that we can bring to Planning Commission and County Council, City Council as well. And then the main one is, do you prefer a water budget approach or the alternative restrictions? Like that's really the main question, is like which one is more appropriate?
Could you say those 2 choices again?
The water
number
budget
7,
versus the
number
other
7, which is the water budget approach, or a slew of 3 or 4 other that puts particular limits on things. The plant list will probably be there no matter what.
Yes.
Because that's the only way you're going to survive with number 7. But the point was with Water Now and Water Alliance was that if you chose number 7, at least half of or more of these go away, because now you've got a room for development where people can pick and choose how they would like their yards to look like, at least in new development. Carl, I'll let you talk.
Well, and I think especially if you're focused initially on commercial or larger planned developments, not an individual residential structure. I don't think any good landscape architect would have any problem with dealing with a water budget. And I think, personally, that simplifies everything immensely. Because then it's not, oh wait, there's this much turf, and then there's this, and then there's this other thing I have to do, and then oh wait, and then there's this thing over here. It just becomes this, okay, we have this much, we create this water budget, we design within that. It might mean that we could, if it's justified to us, have 2,000 square feet of lawn as opposed to 200, but we would then do other things to make that, make sure there's some shade, make sure different things happen. So personally, as someone who's had to redesign an awful lot of landscape architect designed things around this town, I think that would be the more interesting way to go, and also more less restrictive in the sense of a whole list of things. The downside to that, I think, is you don't have a simple checklist, except you do. It's just a little, conceptually, it's a little harder, I think, to wrap your head around potentially. But especially for commercial stuff, I don't see that as a big problem.
Steve, do you have any comments on her question?
So if you did the water budget and they turned the plan in and the final inspection happened and it was laid out according to plan, what's going to make sure it works?
At this point in time, I don't see anything's going to make sure that 5 years later somebody doesn't come tear it up and put something in it. I'm not sure that's necessary.
Right.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think the other thing, from my perspective, as someone who's watched things I've installed around town devolve into all kinds of different things over time, landscapes are one of those things that when the CFO is granted, it's not like a bathroom or a kitchen or a living room or whatever, that it is what it is. It is 100%, it can be the best designed, best installed thing, and if the maintenance sucks, it sucks. And so that is a major failing of landscapes. And I think that that's where, I think that a combination of the number 7 with the water budget, and then wherever the maintenance, I think actually there needs, the number 11, the maintenance issue is really critical. And I think that that's where you get into potentially being able to enforce something in the future.
I think the way that we had talked about enforcement, and there's a reason that it's not specifically in here, is that from the experience of a couple other communities that have employed approaches like this, yes, there will absolutely be some attrition and some of them won't work, but the majority of people, when they install a whole landscape, aren't necessarily coming in, waiting until they can like rip it all out and put in turf, for instance. It's like the odds, the likelihood of people, redoing their whole landscape to be incredibly using a ton of water just isn't that high as far as the communities that have employed these approaches before have found. So it would be, we don't have obviously the city staff to be able to like go out and do really specific enforcement of this, and so that's why it's not specifically contemplated currently.
The other thing, speaking to that briefly, is if you have the proper infrastructure set up, hydrozoning, things set up in a way that makes it work well, then it's more likely that it will continue that way. When you get into trouble is when you have something that's a huge, like what's happened a lot in town, and this is more in residential areas, you'll have a house where the zones are the north side of the house, the south side of the house, the east side of the house, the west side of the house. And then when someone tries to convert that into a different kind of landscape, they can't, unless they rip out all that piping and put in new piping, they can't really create hydrozones because you don't really hydrozone that way. So I think that that's the other piece to it, is if the infrastructure's set up for a more water thrifty landscape, then it will persist more so than if it's set up the way that things have been in the past.
I'd just like to note that number 7 has the same problem as all the rest of them do in terms of maintenance and enforcement.
Right.
They all have the same issue, is that after it's been put in, signed off by the city, and they've got a certificate of occupancy, they can change it too. All of them have that same problem, and that's not something I think we can solve here today on that maintenance issue. Okay, do you have another question?
Well, did you,
So
can
I
we
would-
get
so-
everybody's
so-
response on that?
So you're right. Cara suggested
Water budget.
water
yep.
budget, of course,
With hydrozone.
with hydrozones.
Right, with hydrozones and maintenance.
And did you suggest a
potentially.
plant list too?
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
that kind of
that's a
fits.
given. We're
That's kind
definitely
of a
gonna have
given.
that.
It's kind of a given
Yeah.
at this point in time?
That's for sure.
Okay, I would agree with Cara 100%.
Okay.
Okay?
Steve?
I can see your point on that. I would think you'd lead with the education program so that people realize why it's there.
Yeah.
And continued education would make future homeowners understand the landscaping. It's fine with me.
Great, thank you. Then the second question was, so this is from the consultants, is that they've heard general comments and concerns about cost and feasibility, and which of the recommendations, if any, do you feel might be too costly as a requirement? And so, I think that caveat to that is that if we do go with the water budget approach, then that question kind of goes away, as with many of these other things. So if you feel like if we didn't go the water budget way, you know, are there any of these recommendations that seem like specifically they'd be too costly? Or is that sort of not a concern if the water budget approach is what's used?
Cara, would you like to speak to that first?
I think that, I brought that came up in my conversation with them at almost every single, because, and that, I think is reflected in part in the recommendations that they did come up with. I think that, honestly, landscapes are a luxury. Landscapes are not a necessity. And I think that as long as any ordinance moving forward has that in mind and is not requiring things that, like, there was one thing they talked about at one point of, I don't think it ended up in anything where they wanted to require a certain amount of soil amendment. And that was one that really stuck out to me as an example.
It
of the way
was, and it was the mulch one.
Well,
I think it got taken out.
No, there was
Yeah.
one expressly about, like, you have to have X% soil amendment in everything, and I was like, no, and the reasons I said that was, and part of it was cost, and part of it was that if you truly want to use desert plants, you actually don't want to amend the soil, and because soil amendment is so hard to come by in this area, and so you're instantaneously making something almost impossible to attain financially for a lot of people. So I think as long as things like that, none of these leap out at me, and I do also think that if you have a water budget, you then can create a landscape that inherently is more affordable than if you have some of these other things.
You don't think the mulch is more expensive than the,
No, because I think there's ways to mulch that are pretty cheap. I just spent,
and if you did a hydrozone, it wouldn't matter anyways.
right,
Yeah.
if you hydrozone, it doesn't matter as much, and I just spent about 2 hours helping the various tree companies in town find a bunch of places to do chip drops. You can get mulch for free, as long as the way that the mulch language is written doesn't require it be a decorative colored whatever thing. If it's just, mulch, and then I don't think it actually inherently requires huge cost.
So can I speak then, you're saying that you don't see any of these as being cost prohibitive at any point in time?
I think as long as moving forward, the final language that's always kept in mind, I think you can design any of these to be okay. And that, personally, that's my own thought on that.
So if you go with the water budget, the leading code, does that drop all the requirements for living plant material?
Yeah.
All that disappears?
It all
Yeah,
vanishes
that's all
because
gone.
If you didn't want any landscaping at all around your house,
Yeah,
you could just put some rock around and you're good?
or you could have a pool. Totally.
It's covered in here somewhere.
and that honestly is part of what appeals to me about the water budget is if you have to have a water budget, then if what you want is a lawn to play catch with your kids,
You can have it.
you can have that, but then you have to do some other things that then make sure that it still keeps within that budget.
And there are people who do not have 25% of their lots vegetated around here, that's for
Oh,
sure.
yeah.
And then some people would prefer not to have a vegetated lot, and asking them to maintain 25% vegetation might not be something that they would much rather buy the rock once and walk away.
And honestly, I am a plant geek. Arnie has sat on my front porch and said, dang, you have a lot of plants around here, but I think if I actually calculated in my front yard the percent of vegetation versus flagstone and gravel, I might be hard pressed to meet that 25%. Now that I'm actually thinking about it. So, I that's where I like the water budget concept, because I can just dump all my water into my veggie garden and I'm good.
So I agree with Cara completely on this, as the answer to the question. Steve, do you have any other comments on this question?
No, if the water budget allows you not to have landscaping, then that's fine.
Okay.
Next question?
So the last one was, and again, this would pretty much go away if the water budget is chosen, was which of the 11 standards do you like, and then which ones do you oppose? Like, are there any that you would absolutely not like to see? And I think so far, we've heard that the water budget approach is a pro, the maintenance of, in some variety, is supported. Hydro zones and a plant list are what we have as the 4 that are thumbs up. Are there any that are like a definite thumbs down?
I have a tough time with limiting 200 square feet of grass.
Okay.
Not everybody on this
would that
board-
apply
not-
for
not
commercial as
everybody on this
well?
bo- Excuse me?
Would that apply for commercial as well? Would you
On
have trouble with
commercial, I
that?
have no problem with
Okay.
only 200
I don't have any
square
problem
feet
with
of
it either.
grass.
On residential, it's another story.
Okay, so commercial, 200 square feet is fine, and then for
Yes.
residential, you don't support that limitation? Okay,
I can't see that if somebody wants to play catch with their kid in their yard, they ought to be able to do it. And not everybody might agree with me on that, but I have a problem with that one. I would tell you that I already said there that I wish the gray water ordinance was brought farther forward, but I think in time that'll come, and hopefully with the affiliate, with the coalition, we can work something out there that everybody.
Yeah,
I
and-
think also with the water budget, that inherently leads a little towards that direction as well, because I think if you have a water budget, and then you can actually water some things without even touching that water budget, you've suddenly made that much more appealing.
yeah.
And I'm a big fan on
right,
incentives as
yes,
opposed to sticks.
Exactly, and that's exactly what's contemplated for gray water, would be that it would be incentivized in that way. It would either increase your water budget or decrease your water bill, or a combination of both.
Yeah, but
And
that-
so, just to comment on the gray water, it's definitely still part of the plan to make that happen in some fashion. The things that got complicated were
The things I mentioned.
largely, well, those, but then also multifamily. So there's a lot of condo developments going up, and there's a lot of multifamily development, and figuring out how, and they're often multi-story. So it complicates things as far as the maintenance and responsibility, and where you put that gray water landscaping, like whose it is, because they're mostly designed with common
So this-
areas, right? So like the outside is all common area, and so, it's a different question, kind of legally, and, ownership and responsibility as far as like how you would have a shared gray water situation. So,
That sounds like more fun than managing a shared well.
So I'll
Yeah.
take that point
So
and
that
write
was-
in my
that was
notes
the
that
main
multifamily
thing.
is also another issue. I was speaking
Yeah.
strictly in terms of single-family subdivisions and single-family homes.
Yeah, and single family, I think, is not too complicated. It wouldn't be too hard to require stub outs and to, require the associated landscaping. And we definitely ran into some questions with multifamily, which is a lot of what we're seeing. So that's why that is just a little bit on pause while we try to figure that out.
So the question you had for us, was there something in here that we just
That you
felt
don't like at all?
we couldn't live with?
So, let me clarify this again. If you go with number 7, the budget, number 6, the hydro zones, and number 11, the maintenance requirement, everything else is gonna disappear, right?
It depends. That's something that you could put in your recommendation. So if you go with number 7, the water budget, then you can decide if there are other ones of those that are still important enough to maintain. So for instance, the hydro zone. So you have a water budget approach, but then you also need to have hydro zones, because that's one of the things that, the water board considers that to be an essential component of making that approach work. So if there were other ones of those recommendations that you also wanted to keep with the water budget approach, for instance, living plant material percentage, that could be, a requirement.
So if we went with the water budget, I honestly feel like a plant list, whether it's recommended or required, I don't care. I think recommended is fine. Because honestly, I think most people, they just want
People want it.
recommendations.
Oh, yeah. That's been a request.
And
for
the city
sure.
tried to do that. I'm thrilled, 20-something years ago when I was on planning commission, the city tried to do, and it turned into a bit of a storm that it couldn't be done. So I'm really thrilled that that's actually possible now. But I think if you had the water budget and a plant list and a maintenance and hydro zone, I think the rest are unnecessary, personally.
And the plant list would be recommended, not required?
Doesn't matter to me. I think recommended is fine, because I think, honestly, you can't grow physically it's impossible to grow certain things here. I do think the only thing that there should be a part of the plant list that is, that touches on noxious weeds and up and coming invasive plants.
Not
because
allowed, yeah.
Because there are certain ones, and for instance, Las Vegas is finding miscanthus, which is an ornamental grass, is becoming a problem. So I think having and prohibited is not a word I think that makes sense to use, but I think hearkening to the noxious weed law and then talking about, because I think this is a community that pays attention to that, and Ravenna grass is a great, for instance, that got planted en masse all over the place about 30 years ago, and now it's popping up on the entire river corridor, and it's costing thousands of dollars to send people out to keep it out of the side canyons. And so I think with some explanation and outreach, people can understand that, okay, you like the look of that, but what can I use that's similar? You know, and honestly, the other thing, I do agree with Steve on Firewise landscape standards do they really fit in this water context? However, I think in the commercial, well, we also are in Indiana where if you don't mow it, you will have a forest up to the side of the building. But I do think that that's an important thing to have with, especially as we're pushing into some of the places that will get developed that might be near riparian corridors and stuff where your fire hazard is potentially higher. I think it makes sense, but I don't know that it's not really part of water.
So what I've heard is that from here we seem to agree that the water budget idea is the best one out there. We would support that with a plant list, a maintenance, and of course hydrozoning would be part of that. She did bring up a good point about the weed situation here, and as someone who works in the riparian corridor, I've got issues with plants that are planted here in town that obviously anything on the weed list isn't sold in nurseries, so that doesn't need to be not on the do not plant.
Yeah. The issue comes with the ones that aren't yet on the list. So like for instance, there's a little, not that anyone would buy this, but there's a little itty bitty grass from, I forget where, somewhere in the Mediterranean region, called schismus, that's now a problem. Ravenna grass is actually not yet on the noxious weed list.
We're trying to get it on there.
Yeah, but there's others that I think may come up, and so I think just some language in any kind of recommended plant list is like, pay attention to, you know, if there are plants that may well be too good to be true.
Do you want like a discouraged plant?
Right, something like that. That's a little softer than prohibited,
Yeah.
but
Please
you
don't.
know.
We would really appreciate it if you didn't.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, so that being said, I think we've answered your question. We
Yeah.
okay with that? All three of your questions?
I think, yeah, that's really helpful. I think that the other question that I have is just in relation to the percent living material. And if, I know that it does take less water to water rocks, which we don't do, but there is something to be said for having living plant material from a shade perspective and from a cooling.
Urban heat effect.
Urban heat effect, right. And so is there, you know, what do you feel about that and the trade-off there? You know, like I think most people are in agreement that we don't want the entire city to only be rocks because that doesn't actually help us with some other problems. So, you know, is there a number that would be reasonable to include as a minimum requirement so that you don't end up with
Can I
just
answer this
yards
first,
of
you
rocks
guys?
or not?
Can I answer first? Yeah. Okay, so in my opinion, there's not enough people out there that just want rocks in their yard that it's going to be a major consideration. Okay, there are people that want those, but I really don't think that more than 25% of them, people out there really want just rocks in their yard. There are some, and that's fine. And I don't think that the number of people that would want just rocks in their yard would be an issue in terms of how the community looked. And there's also a fair amount of what I term xeriscaping going on right now in Moab, where there is no water being applied, and it's just weeds and dead stuff, and that's just the way it is in Moab. And if you can't force somebody, a landscape's a luxury, if they don't want to have a landscape, asking them to do 25% is not going to work. And so my point is I don't think there's enough people out there that would want to do that, and that the effect of those people would be a major factor in terms of urban effect.
I think if you talk about just commercial, however.
Yeah. So I was talking residential again.
Yeah.
Excuse me, I was
Well,
talking
and
residential.
I have a
And commercial's
question.
another story, so that was my comment on residential. Can I ask you just a question?
Well-
What do you guys think about residential and requiring a certain percentage of?
Yeah, can I just say something really quick? Just that the question is more like, are you afraid that
Let
that
us
would?
work through it. We need
No,
to
no,
get-
totally.
let us
I'm
work
just,
through it.
totally. I just mean that, are you afraid of the possibility that, because we're talking about new development, that developers would then see it as a cost savings and not ever install any landscaping? Like you would never end up with landscaping if you didn't have any requirement.
So
That's what I mean.
currently,
Like, would that- 'cause that's a
currently
possibility.
community rebuilds and other people don't install any landscaping when they sell their house, when they build their houses.
Actually,
They do.
they do have to have a landscape plan.
Do they have a landscape
Yep,
plan?
and they have to have a certain amount of stuff installed.
Do they?
Yep, but it's not very much.
It's not very much.
It's
It's
not
a
very
couple
much,
trees.
and there's quite a few that have never finished.
I've never finished. So we're talking residential at this point in time. And,
Both, yeah.
and her point being said is that if a developer's coming in, they might think that it's cheaper just to put in rocks, and at that point in time, if the person buying the position.
Good luck with it being cheaper to just put in rocks, but.
Good luck with that. But my point was, I think if somebody had that kind of yard, they would probably, and they wanted landscaping, they would put something in.
So I think the current standards that we have are sufficient
For residential?
for both. Residential says no living materials are required, but you do have to do something on your front and side yards. And then commercial says at least 5% living material and no more than 80. 5%, if you look at it, is a pretty good number.
I'm sorry, because I'm gonna stick with mine. I don't think we need to require landscaping on residential. Commercial's another story. I believe commercial.
Well, she's talking percent living material.
Yeah.
And I think, I'm trying to, because harkening back to my years on planning commission and just the number of times that you have an ordinance and then what happens is people seem to take it when they put together a proposal as a challenge to how to push the envelope. So I'm taking it to the far extreme of like, well, what would that actually look like? And I'm also thinking of a couple businesses downtown. You know, there's some places where there just isn't any space for landscaping because there just isn't. There's, you know, and then
Like the
there's
tire shop?
well, I like, you know, the O'Reillys, that was so, they were so cute when they came, they're like, we have these holes and we want vegetation. So I spent some time figuring out what would actually grow in this weird little hole with no.
Go ahead. I didn't mean to digress. But go
No,
ahead.
but I think that harkens to your point of people do want to see some vegetation, most of them. There are those. And there's a hotel right near my house that's one example on the far other extreme of they were required to put in a certain amount of vegetation back in the day, and it is all gone now, all of it. And they have slowly but surely made sure they have no vegetation. That is their preference. So that's giving me a little pause on saying there shouldn't, you know, which I do like this idea of at least 5%. But. And in an ordinance type situation, I think you kind of have to have some number or metric to measure it against. You can't really say, you know, there's no other way to enforce it. I don't like it. It rubs me wrong, but I wouldn't jump up and down screaming everything is untenable if there was something like that in there.
The 25%
Seems
pretty high.
kind of high to me.
Walk around town, even businesses that have some kind
Yeah.
of landscaping, I doubt if that would be 25%.
Yeah, and I think it's more important that it's not lawn. Like if all they have is lawn and it's
You got
it's
the
lawn that
turf.
that nobody's using, that's got a south slope that you can't water well anyway, like that I think is silly, but yeah.
So I'm getting you from both of you that some sort of minimum requirement on vegetation for both commercial and residential would be appropriate. It's just the nuances of it are the devil's in the details is
Yeah.
what we're getting at.
Yeah, and I think 25% is too high. I don't know what the right number is, and I don't really like even having to have one, but I get why you might want one in there.
So there you have the answer to that question. I'm going to make I've seen a couple of apartment buildings going up in Salt Lake City at this point in time. And the Salt Lake City, I don't know how they are doing it or what codes they're using, but they are basically telling these larger commercial developments to come up with a landscaping plan, and they will change them to suit their needs and tell them which plants they're planting and so on and so forth. At this point in time, if you're looking for ideas on commercial, I'd go out and see what some of the larger cities are that currently have some sort of water conservation ordinances for commercial development and see what they're actually doing. Because we do have a tough time. There's not a lot of space.
That's how these were informed. We have a number of codes that were referenced.
Okay.
So that's where these came from.
So,
Yeah.
But the reference in this is Aurora, Colorado, which has got a lot more water than we do.
I'm not sure how to word it, but what you've heard is that yes, some sort of minimum requirement
But
would be
25 is too
necessary.
high.
But how you get to that and what you make it look decent and make it water conserving is a lot more difficult question that we can't answer at this point in time.
But yeah, and I think even just simple things like someone might just have some trees. That could be plenty.
Yeah.
That could
spin
easily,
up?
because how do you measure it too? That's the other thing that's been going on in my life.
Is
So-
there,
It's gonna be 5% when it's fully grown. Right now, it's just this big.
a follow-up question to that is, so if there is no requirement for living plant material, should there be a requirement for cover of some kind? Or is dirt, like open dirt, acceptable, for instance?
And now, are we talking commercial or residential?
Either one.
I think with commercial, there should be something, mulch or something.
Especially something that'll hold the water.
Right,
From a perspective of somebody who deals with our creeks, I need something that holds the water back.
Yeah.
Especially when you forget to put in a freaking sedimentation pond.
I think when it comes to residential, I keep going back to landscapes are a luxury and forcing people to have to pay for something like that. I mean, yes, it'd be better if they had mulch down and
This is
and
only
that.
new development though. at this
I know, but even so, if you're really trying to get at affordable housing and moderate income housing, landscapes aren't cheap, and plant materials not getting any cheaper.
I'm just thinking about dust.
Yeah, no, I get it.
Yeah.
I totally get it. I struggle with that a little bit.
The other side of that coin is that after they get in, they can do whatever they want with it.
Right.
And so requiring them to have it to begin with,
Right.
if they don't want it and they're just
Right.
let it go, doesn't seem to solve your dust problem.
Right. And yeah, I don't think I can come up with a solid preference in this meeting format. I would need more time to think about that one, to actually have a comfort level.
The devil's in the details, as they say, huh? Steve, do you have any other comments on her question?
Well, the current standard for non-living ground cover, residential none, commercial over 30,000 is a maximum coverage of 20%. I don't know.
And that may be more applicable in the county where there are larger areas where, you know, if you grade the whole lot and then, you know, because I think we actually got a number of dust complaints at the county when I was over there from developments that didn't pin anything down.
Yeah.
You know, but it's definitely just, yes, we can just kind of see what.
Well, and the one thing in city limits that strikes me as a established business that has a dust problem is the food truck court. And a part of why there's a dust problem there is, one, they've never landscaped anything at all. It's got a really great goat head harvest going on there. But also inherently in how that's laid out. I mean, the dust that comes off of that thing is amazing at certain times of the year. So putting, and I don't know how you would do that with a cover because they have gravel down, they have the different things, and it's still plenty dusty. So, and the bulk of that area is, even if they landscaped 25%, which they were supposed to and just never did, and that's never been enforced, people park there instead. I don't know how you would address that. I mean, that place couldn't exist if there was a code that prevented, you know, see what I'm saying? Like, they would have had to actually paved it instead of leaving it gravel. And I personally would rather see it be gravel that can actually infiltrate some water instead of run it all off. So it's kind of, there's some nuance to that so anyway, I just suddenly had a thought of, like, that was actually a solid example of a spot that has a large enough area that it matters. And I also think another one to look at would be the hospital, where I don't like their landscape in the slightest, but what percent, like, that would be an interesting, I think it could be interesting to inform some of these, to look at some examples that we already have in the city that are good and bad, and come up with some metrics based on, you know, like the library versus the hospital. Something like that I think could really help, and that could even help on the education outreach side of life too. So
Totally.
I think that's good advice.
Okay.
We've got some other things to talk about today. I'd just like to ask a couple questions. I sent an email to you all on the state water conservation stuff the other day. Was the one that did you get an opportunity to read at page 9, Mila, that I sent to everybody the other day? It's not in your packet.
I'm not sure. It's not in the packet.
No, it's not in the packet. I sent you an email with an article from the Salt Lake Tribune.
I'll read it.
You did not read it? State's going to start requiring, I believe, all state buildings, and it might try to require city buildings to have 20% of their area be, or less, be turf and things like that. Those are all state requirements. I just found it interesting is that the state is now getting into the landscaping ordinances business also. And where that takes us might be interesting too. So I'll leave it at that. If nobody read it,
I read it.
you read it?
Yeah.
And there's only one part in there about landscaping. The rest of it was more bigger Wasatch Front issues. Well,
Yeah.
not necessarily bigger, but Wasatch Front issues. But I found it interesting that they're going to require, I thought they said cities in there too, Steve, but that they require cities to.
It says state-owned buildings, all new ones are limited on how much turf they can have.
Yeah.
And they have a requirement to reduce their turf by 25% in like 2026.
2026?
I wondered how the new school was going to work on that.
I'm thinking of some of the churches around, not Moab, but other parts of the state.
This is state-owned.
That have some,
buildings.
I know it's only state, but there's some pretty big lawns out there.
Yes, there are. Okay, so that being said, I didn't mean to digress for too much, but I'd like to get on with the next agenda item, if you don't mind, and that would be the statement of work. We're a little confused. I'm going to ask Mila a couple questions. We had, me and Cara had a discussion with the mayor and Ronnie on this coalition. And the mayor and Ronnie seem to agree that it would be helpful to have somebody on the water board and be at least somehow part of this group. It's not defined in the scope of work how that person would be an affiliate or part of the coalition. Right now, the coalition is just the 3 water holders. It's only 3 of the 4. It appears to me it's only 3 of the 4. And I'm going to comment on that also. But not to, just to kind of get it over with, if there was an opportunity for a member of this board to play more an active role in this development of, in the statement of work and the work that becomes of it, I'd be happy if Steve were to do that for us.
I'd be very interested in that, to see what their plan evolves into.
Carl, would you have any objections to Steve being on it?
Nope.
Okay, that being said, Steve, I'm going to remind you that to some extent you are the water board. So on some of the items that are in the scope of work, we're probably going to talk to you on some of our opinions on them. And we'd be happy if you presented our opinions as opposed to a different point of view, an opinion that the 3 of us can agree on. And I hope you can understand that, can't you? I thought you could. I'm going to ask the first question on this statement of work. I believe it says in here Moab Irrigation Company, but then when Chuck was talking the other day, giving the presentation, he never mentioned the Moab Irrigation Company once. Has it been changed so that the Moab Irrigation Company is, the coalition member is the Moab Irrigation Company? It says so on item 201. Is that still the case?
So I am not involved in this process.
Okay. The reason why I say that, because Chuck did not mention the Moab Irrigation Company once. They are.
Marty?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, and I have to apologize to everyone. I'm sorry again that I'm not there in person. Again, I'm very sorry. I won't miss another meeting in person. But so I'm catching certain things and not others, and I apologize because that's on me. But I think what you're asking is, has anyone clarified the membership of the Moab Irrigation Company in this water providers group?
Yes, that's my question.
Yeah. So I've asked about this at a number of meetings, and I was told that the Moab Irrigation Company, kind of 2 different things. That they're invited, but they're so small they don't necessarily come. But then I've also been told that, yeah. So anyway, I have been told that, but I don't know how it's. I don't know that if anything is formal. So I haven't had a chance to ask Mike or other members if they've attended or, yeah.
Okay, so they weren't a signer to the cooperative. Is it a cooperative agreement? Or
I know. I noticed that too. Yeah.
And I will remind everybody that they are actually the biggest water provider here in Spanish Valley.
Yeah, and so it is confusing to me why that. Yeah, that remains confusing to me.
And I think a lot of the future of irrigation in Spanish Valley and Moab will rest on conservative use of Moab Irrigation Company's water. But that being said, let's move on. Steve, do you have anything in particular about this scope of work that you wanted to talk about?
I'm really pleased to see it. I think it's a step in the right direction, where everybody in the aquifer gets together in one organization.
To talk about alternatives?
Yes.
Okay.
Future plans.
I'm clarifying future plans. To
Into
talk
the-
about alternatives.
100-year plan.
Yes.
One thing that I would add to the list is possibly the Division of Wildlife and Nature Conservancy, because they're going to be wanting water in the Memphis wetlands and possibly infrastructure in the future. You could get the coalition and the Division of Wildlife working on the same infrastructure if they needed it to
So
supplement their
there's
water.
been a long-term discussion on using the wastewater treatment plant's effluent to augment the amount of water in our very dry wetlands, and that it's an ongoing discussion. It would be nice if the TNC and the DWRI, which co-manage the wetlands, were at least.
DWR, not RI.
Excuse me, DWR. Excuse me, DWR,
difference.
which co-manage the wetlands. We're at least an affiliate of this coalition, if not necessarily a member of the coalition, but an affiliate of the coalition. I would agree with you on that. Okay?
Well, it would seem like that would fit into some of these things of where they get data and information, because it's part of the system, but are they actual coalition members, or are they advisory, or, that's the one thing I don't understand about this, because it feels
Yeah, I
fairly narrow to me with what's in here.
I understand it, and I could be mistaken, and we're asking for clarification, I guess, Mila, on this, is that the coalition members are the Moab City and
I
Public
understand
Works.
that, yeah.
Which supposedly includes us, okay, we are mentioned there, the Water Conservation Board, so we should have a seat at the table. Grand Water and Sewer, Grand County will be there, Moab Irrigation Company, and San Juan Spanish, along with San County. Anybody else that's mentioned here would be an affiliate.
Right, and I guess what I'm getting at is the data collection phase and the, is probably where I would see some of these other things like TNC and DWR, maybe that's where that fits. And I don't know that Mila knows because she's not a part of this, so I don't know that Mila's gonna be able to give us any answers. Maybe it's just you could take some notes and find some answers for us.
So we decided not to make a recommendation on this, probably because we don't have enough information to make a recommendation. We don't need for another 2 months, and this will be going on before all of that
Right.
time. So if we can at least take some notes and get something to Chuck, that would be great.
Yeah. Because while I see what they're saying the coalition is, but I feel like it's missing some pieces, like TNC and DWR, among others, and so it just seems like, maybe it's implied in some of this data collection and evaluation that others will be involved, but I don't know the answer to that.
I think talking with Chuck and Carly would be the way to find
And
those
I was
answers.
hoping Chuck would be here, but apparently he's not available. You want me to see if I can get him to come down? And we could talk about the other things before he gets here.
Sure.
I can at least try to call.
I can get in touch with him if you want to keep.
Can you text
Yeah,
him?
sure.
Text him while we're talking for a second. I have some issues with some of the alternatives that they're dealing with in here. I believe all the alternatives that they're talking about need to be researched. All the data, there's no problem getting data, okay? There's no problem with coming up with alternatives. There's no problem with going through the process of evaluating options that we probably would not consider viable or recommend to the city just because we don't think that they're viable and would recommend them. We should know the data on all of them, okay? And what I'm speaking specifically to is the sharing of water rights. There may be opportunities for us to share a water right for a year that might turn out to be okay. If somebody's in trouble, for instance, we could share our water. But in terms of the city giving up its water rights to an agency that is not the city, that is not something I would ever recommend to the city at this point in time. That's my thought on that. And so it's okay to me that they evaluate the opportunity there to have supposedly a water district for the entire valley if they want to evaluate it. But from my perspective, I would never recommend that. Steve, I'm letting you know that.
So I got the impression they might follow the model that Washington County, St. George area, when they developed their coalition back in the 60s. Every city and everybody that owned a well or a water right kept it. But as that particular entity needed more water, then the coalition was responsible to develop the next stage of water supply.
And that's
And
something
wholesale it
that,
to the city. I
that
would
makes
think-
sense to me.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's why I think it's great that they're gonna evaluate all the alternatives. Another statement I don't like in here at this point in time is that the coalition members may select preferred alternatives. I wish that statement was,
Where is that on
that's
here?
on 106, page 2, Exhibit A. It says Moab City and public officials here, but the engineering department and public works are going to be at these meetings, not the city council. And I believe any plan that comes up with needs to be vetted through the city council, and the city council should be aware of all the alternatives and the opportunities, not just a certain select group of preferred alternatives by the coalition. Does that make sense, what I just said there?
Yep.
I'd hate to see the city council being given a smaller set of opportunities without all of the opportunities, all the details out there. Steve, does that make sense to
This
you?
is Ronnie. Yeah, thanks. That makes sense to me.
So
Last sentence, 106.
yeah, I was just looking at the whole section here. So the way I read this is kind of like step one of a multi-step process.
Right. And I don't necessarily want the coalition to write off some of the
And
alternatives.
so I think what you're saying, Ernie, is you have concern of if the coalition members select preferred alternatives, that other alternatives would then never be discussed again.
Yes. And I think the city council needs to hear all
And
the
so-
alternatives.
And so would it be acceptable to you if if, say there's a list of 30 alternatives and the coalition members select 14 of them as preferred, but they still list all 30? Is
Yes,
that acceptable?
That's acceptable to me.
So I think it just depends on how this is interpreted.
Yes.
Of does selecting preferred alternatives mean others are just off the table? Or is it that, okay, here's our
Exactly.
whole list, let's prioritize these as the top 14 preferred ones?
It's exactly what I'm trying to get at, apparently.
So the Moab City and public officials are listed as coalition members. Wouldn't they be involved in that process?
The way it looks,
As of right now, that's not what's happening, I guess, is what I
as of
think
right
I'm
now,
understanding.
it's the engineering department,
And so
No.
that's a little narrow.
as opposed to, it's not, and we can't expect the city council members to be at every single one of these meetings. That's not gonna happen. Somebody has to represent the city. My point is, what they come back to the table with, what they have, is that the city council members get all the alternatives to digest and consider.
So you're saying that the city council and probably also the Grand County and San Juan commissioners ought to have a review process somewhere in here?
When they come up with their plan, which is what I believe, they're gonna come up with solutions, they should be listing all the alternatives. And all the alternatives should be made available to not only just the public, but especially to the city and Grand County council members, who will be the ones that have to vote on what they want to do. They-
So the final plan may, for instance, say, here's the direction we suggest, but somewhere else in the plan, it's gonna explain why those 14 options were selected out of the larger field of 30.
That's correct. I just don't want them to go away.
Right.
I haven't, they talk about stakeholder input here, but I don't see any place where they're actually grabbing it other than getting data from people.
Yeah. They do have that, well, yeah, you're right.
It says presentation of stakeholder input in a video meeting, additional data needs and availability.
Well, they do have a draft plan presented to members and stakeholders. That's section 410. And then they do have a public engagement plan with follow-up technical analysis meeting with internal stakeholders. I don't know what an internal stakeholder is as opposed to just a stakeholder.
Yeah.
That's 411.
I do, maybe I'm getting, I must admit, this is from a provider's standpoint, and they're looking at it from a provider's standpoint. What can we do from an engineering perspective to meet the needs of the community in the next 100 years? And so I like the idea that they're doing this, and maybe I'm getting a little too carried away on the stakeholders. When the management plan comes out, I'm sure the stakeholders will come out of the woodwork. If I could say that, okay? They will come out of the woodwork and they will voice their opinions. So maybe we should just leave it at that and forget that last statement about stakeholders, okay? Is there any other comments you guys have to make at this point in time?
I think the biggest thing to me is just, I do think it's important that, especially since it's Moab City and public officials, and it also calls out the Water Conservation and Drought Management Advisory Board, I think it is important that Steve, but someone from here is there so that we can, and I think it should be a standing agenda item for this group until this process has been gone through, so that there's plenty of time at each meeting for you to let this group know, like a summary, so that, and then any, questions or topics that are like, what do you think of this? Or, what's input on that, or whatever, so that there's some chance for that.
So I have a question at this point in time. Are the meetings and discussions of these, are they going to be public meetings like this where there'll be YouTube associated with them that we could actually watch them?
Sorry, I really am not involved in this process. You'll have to ask
So
Most of
Carly.
the meetings are by Zoom.
Or by Zoom, so there should be a record.
Well,
Yeah.
but whether or not they're able to be accessed by others is a different, just because it's a Zoom meeting doesn't mean it can be accessed by others.
Yes.
And it doesn't seem like,
It does seem appropriate, Cara, that we have a standard agenda item to discuss the statement of work and the progress with the coalition. Okay?
but what I see when I read this quickly, and don't agonize over each line,
Right.
is it does strike me as a somewhat opaque process. And that is a little bit concerning. I think that if the public engagement, if how it is put out into the community
411.
411, if that actually is done in a way that allows for some feedback, understanding that sometimes that's a place things can get very bogged down and in minutia that's maybe not relevant, but still, I think that that's a very important aspect of it. And I guess the other question I have on this is, what's the real purpose and intent, and how does this fit into broader? Because if this truly is the providers, and we know that providers' purpose is to provide water, how does that fit into larger discussions? Are there larger discussions, regional discussions about conservation measures, about those sorts of things? Because if that's supposed to be in here, I'm not sure I see it.
Yeah. And I agree with you on the conservation part, and I think the county has a little more difficulty with the larger lot sizes than the city would have, and we're obviously struggling with city ordinances for landscaping measurements, so landscaping ordinances, so it'll be a tough bridge to cross. I don't know how to comment on that at this point in time.
Well, I think if it's feasible, if Steve's gonna be able to go to these meetings, I think that's maybe just something to be keeping in mind, is like sifting out, how does this fit into that? Because it's all fine and good to say, hey, we can put pipes here, and there's a tank over there, and there's gonna be homes over here, but if there's not enough water to fill that pipe, then that's where you get into the water management side of it, as opposed to just delivery. So I think that's stepping into this for you, that's a question I would love to have a little more information from this coalition of how does it fit into that?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I went through the St. George model, and they actually do a lot of conservation type stuff in there too, and I would hope that'd be included. And
Right.
save a little bit from Mother Nature
Right.
type of thing.
Right.
Okay, is there any more discussion on the scope of work? We don't need a motion to send Steve at this point in time. Steve's our representative.
I guess I do have a question.
Can I ask one, Steve? If you have a problem making a meeting, will you please notify me or Cara or the three
Okay,
two of
yeah,
us? And
I
maybe
don't know if
one
they
of
have a
us,
schedule yet, but.
right?
Yeah. So this begs the question to me of the future of this group and how do we function with only 3 members? Do we need to be getting more members? What's going on?
So, I don't know if either knows the answer to that question. I believe those are still thoughts in process at this point in time, and I think the mayor and
It's up to
Ronnie,
the mayor,
and
yeah, and
especially
the
mayor,
council.
is actually still mulling things over in her mind. For our discussion that we had, Steve, for Steve's benefit, Cara was very good at letting them know that the ordinance or that they passed, our organic act that built us, doesn't really clarify how we're supposed to act or what we're supposed to do and what cities people are supposed to be involved and so on and so forth, and how the city's supposed to respond and what sort of processes we have for our recommendations. And I believe the mayor is mulling that over at this point in time, Cara. I don't think we've got an answer to that, do we?
I haven't heard anything. Yeah.
No answer is.
So far, we have Mila is saddled with us, but beyond that, we don't know anything. And then also that just begs the whole thing of what is a quorum, how many.
Right now, we're 3.
I know, and that was like, today was for me particularly rough getting here, which was fine. I'm happy to be here, but that it's gonna make it very hard to actually be able to hold meetings if there's only 3 of us. So if we aren't gonna expand back to our former
I think
7 or whatever it was, then that's a problem.
I think we'll have more guidance here by May.
I hope so.
And that's when our next meeting is at this point in
Okay.
time. And so from what I got with our discussion is we were gonna just keep on keeping on. And,
Right?
and they would let us know when
Yeah.
they figured it out.
And so then I guess that answers my question, which was, if we don't really know what's going on with this group, how do we say, okay, Steve, you're representing this group moving forward? But I'm good with that. I can
You're good with
tolerate a
that.
high level of
I-
ambiguity. I'm good with that.
I did understand the mayor that she wanted some sort of recommending entity out there that represented water conservation and water use in this valley. She thought there was something would be required.
Yeah.
Whether the board would be a city board or how that would look, she was considering options.
Okay.
Okay? So the next item on our agenda is my item. And I believe, has everybody read the discussion? I didn't quite know how to put this together in terms of a recommendation. We put recommendations out before that were more of whereas and not necessarily as formal. Some were more formal and some were less formal. I did not have a good template, so I just made my own up at this point in time. And I kind of like this template. I can change this template at any point in time if you like. But what I did was I put down the background. And the first one was supposed to be,
That's your whereases.
yeah, the
But
discussion.
it's a lot, no, the background is the whereases, but it's a lot easier to read as a paragraph. Thank you.
So the first one I have is the water rights appropriation policy. We did recommend to the city that they recommended the state to close the aquifer. And it's stated in there that Teresa has a tough time doing that. I had conversations with Mark Stilson about
Teresa?
this. Teresa is the new state engineer.
Oh, okay.
Who is being called upon to do enormous heavy lifting at this point in time. And Mark's comment was to me that he's having, I'll give you, okay, I know we're on YouTube. The specific issue was there was a land development up here near the Moab City Springs that was requesting a whole lot of water. And they could get 6.73 out of several different lots. And it would possibly impact the Moab City Springs. So the water rights turned them down. Okay, they said, no, we think it'll impact the Moab Springs. They haven't been sued yet. But Mark looked at it and goes, that's when I gotta say, our policy here isn't working for us anymore. So he feels like he would like to change the policy here. We've heard Cash say that in mob meetings, his underling, and other people say that from the water rights that week, and even Teresa say that 2.5 years ago, that we could change the appropriation policy here. Which basically would limit it to smaller applications generally is what I'm getting at this point in time. We've already recommended that the valley be closed, so I don't believe we would be against changing allocation that would be further restrictive of more holes in the valley. And so what Mark is suggesting at this point in time is that we have the city of Moab reach out to Mark, have Mark come in and Teresa come in and discuss water allocation policy and what would work for our area and how they feel about what would work for our area, and if the city would support it. Mark seems to think that a one-on-one conversation with Teresa and the mayor and perhaps the chair of Grand County Council would be the best way to get Teresa's involved in this. The section of DWRI that does this kind of analysis just comes back to Mark saying, we're too busy. So what I'm asking is for the mayor to reach out to the water rights and invite them down at some point in time and have a discussion.
So this is coming from discussions you've had with Mark Stilson?
Yes.
So that's, okay, then that's all I needed to know. I think that's fine.
Did you, is any of the wording inappropriate? Did you guys have any wordsmithing associated with this?
It looks okay.
No, it's fine to me.
Okay, I think it's an appropriate time. The policy hasn't been changed in quite some time.
I think the recommendation, I would add something that adds some urgency to this based on reading the background and discussion, because right now, recommending city engages with regional UDWRI staff in the near future,
I could do,
or in the next 6 months, or something that implies that this is not just, oh gee, we should get around to this, but put some kind of urgency to it. I think that would be important. Because I do think there is a bit of urgency to it.
Yes, but from Mark's perspective, there is.
Right, and if Mark's concerned, then I'm terrified. Let's just put it that way. Because Mark hasn't sounded very concerned at all until right this moment. It's the first I'm hearing of it. So if Mark's concerned, I think, yeah, this needs to be a priority.
Okay.
Like now, yesterday.
Very near future. Well, obviously, it's already become a problem for him.
Right.
And he doesn't want to get sued.
Right.
And I don't blame him. And he wants to he's trying to protect the city of Moab and current water rights holders. And I'm very happy that he's doing that.
That's it's
Okay,
a
so
job.
I can add something in there. So if that's the case, can I get a motion to make this recommendation?
I would move to have this first recommendation with just some urgency added to the actual recommendation itself. Otherwise, it could be presented as written. Except you have to spell Carly's name right. There's no E.
There's no E? I swear I looked it up. I swear I looked it up, you guys. It must be wrong on my phone. That's all I can say.
With the proper spelling.
Is there any more?
I just happened to catch that.
Is there any more discussion? No? Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We might just get out of here on time. I didn't think that was going to happen. Okay, the second recommendation I had came from discussions, again, with Mark Stilson and with the UGS. Although I do not have any formal relationship with this project going on in the Matheson Wetlands, where Mark is very concerned, and the Salinity Forum, the United States, the Western States Salinity Forum, and other people are really concerned with the water budget in the wetlands and some of the possibilities there. scientifically, I don't believe it's a problem. But that being said, Mark has engaged the UGS to determine better, or at least monitor more, what is going out the back end on our system here. And one of those is Skakel Springs. At this point in time, they've got some devices that don't measure actual flow, the actual quantity in the duck puddles. So there's a term for them, compound monitoring. So they measure that you go there in a month and it'll tell you how much water went through in the last month. It won't give you a graph of what the flow was. It just tells you how much water went through in the last month, which you can stick in a pipe, and that's working pretty good for the duck puddles. The Skakel Springs was, it wasn't in writing, but it was in writing that the springs should be better monitored, but in their presentations, the USGS said Skakel Springs is key because it's on the bottom end of where we are getting our water at. And at this point in time, there is no way for the Utah Geological Survey to get monitoring devices in there to measure the whole flow. The headworks are not just set up appropriately for it. So the discussion that we had, and I don't know why that I was brought into this other than that I live here and I know everybody involved. Mark and the UGS have talked to me to work with the city. I went to talk to Levi and Conrad, and I've talked to Chuck Williams about this, and their biggest concern with Skakel Springs is that they don't want to modify where the water is actually coming out because they're afraid that they might change the flow, which is justified at this point in time. It is also, they're not required to do this. They're required to monitor how much water they actually take from the springs. The other thing that Chuck has said to me too is that we're going to be using all that water sooner or later, and that he might have an idea where he just might start taking it all right now. I wouldn't be opposed to that, because if
then they'd be measuring it.
and they'd be measuring it. I wouldn't be opposed to it from the fact that all of a sudden you've turned your dry water rights into paper water rights, or paper water rights
Into wet water, yeah.
rights. And solve the issue with whether the wetlands are dependent upon Skakel Springs. So, which I don't believe they are. It's actually a small amount of water they're getting from Skakel Springs. And Skakel Springs really doesn't have all that much water. But for the purpose of the work that's going on right now, and from Mark's perspective, it is in the interest of the city to know how much water is coming out of Skakel Springs and to know whether it's declining or know whether it's more in the winter, more or less in the summer, and things like that. Mark seems to believe the city should know that. We're not asking the city to pay for it in this recommendation. I'd like to note that at this point in time, and I made that clear to Chuck, that funding for this, if the city would have to sponsor it because it's on city property, and the city would have to approve it because it's on city property, and they need to protect their springs. So they need to be involved, but they wouldn't necessarily have to pay for it.
Right. So I've got a couple suggestions.
Well, first of all, I'm going to ask you, is this something that the board, first of all, you feel this is appropriate for this board to talk about? I do. I think it is. It's a water demand issue and a water quantity issue for the city. And I think I agree with Mark that we ought to know how much water we actually will have out of Skakel Springs when we start taking it off, and whether it's on the decline.
Yeah, monitoring's the only thing that's going to give us an idea.
Okay.
Of how
So
much
it's an appropriate item at this point in time.
Yes.
Okay. And then the second thing is my approach here, that the city doesn't have to pay for it, and but the city needs to oversee the project, and be responsible for the project. That makes sense to you guys? Okay.
It's their property.
It's their property, yeah. And
Both the wet stuff and the dry stuff.
Okay, so then if that's the case, if there's comments on my recommendation, I'd love to hear them at this
So
point. So
my suggestion on this would be at the last sentence in your discussion, most of it's fine. Last sentence in your discussion, funding for the project will be determined after bid selection and may not involve city funding. I would say may not require city funding.
may not require city funding.
And then the other thing that my other suggestion would be in the recommendation section, to strike the last sentence entirely, because it's just repetitive of what you said, and then discussion.
Okay,
And also, then the recommendation would just be one sentence, and I would also remove the words "develop a request for proposals to add," and I would just say, the board would recommend either the engineer's office or public works department, or maybe you just say the city, add a structure below the current headworks of Skakel Springs that will allow monitoring of the total outflow. Just keep it very simple, because you've already said all this stuff about
okay,
the bidding process and whatever else, and you don't need
Okay.
to micromanage that in the recommendation, just make the recommendation. You guys, y'all ought to do this. And you probably ought to do it fairly soon.
well, since since the 3/4 of the monitoring that's going on out there has been instigated, and
Right.
this is where the problem is coming, is that UGS can't figure out how to do it.
Right.
And that's, they come into a roadblock here.
Yeah.
And that's what they call me?
So, but yeah, that would be, I mean, otherwise I'm fine with this, but I just think that would tighten up the
That sounds
end
fine.
a
Would you
little
like
bit.
me to take out the engineer's office or public works, or just put the city? And just put the city?
I think maybe just the city, because the city would probably assign it to
City
one of
will,
those anyway.
yeah.
It's not like they're gonna have Mila do it.
Nope, definitely not.
Okay. Would anybody like to make a motion on that with those changes?
I move that we send this forward with those changes to the city.
I'll second.
Is there any further discussion? And all in favor?
Aye.
Passed unanimously. Is there anything else on our agenda? Oh, staff and board reports.
Well, and Arnie, I just heard from Chuck, he could come down at 4 to chat with you if you'd like.
He'd come down at 4 to chat with me?
Yes,
I
it's
need to
3:55.
not go long.
Okay, I'll just talk to Chuck.
I mean, in the meeting, or,
I'll just talk to Chuck.
okay, so we don't
Yeah, it
need him
wouldn't
to
be
be
part
here
of
at
the
4?
meeting.
Okay,
But I mean, if he can come down here, that'd be great. If he wants me to come up to his office, I'll come up to his office. I have 15 minutes for him.
okay, I'll let him know that
Sadly, I don't.
he doesn't need to be part of the water board meeting then.
No.
Okay.
Okay, staff and board reports. I knew there was something I needed to tell you guys, but I can't remember what it was. Do you guys want to go first, Cara? Steve?
I'm good.
You're good?
I think the biggest thing I've got is more of a question of just, it'd be really cool to know sooner than later what this is. So I don't know if you have thoughts or ideas or questions
Yes.
yourself on
It's
that
it's
topic?
out of my hands as well.
Mhm.
So the mayor, my understanding is that after your meeting is that the mayor is going to think about it with the council and let us all know.
Do you have any, while I'm trying to think of my staff reports, do you have any reports you'd like to give us at this point in time?
I don't think there's anything other than, we had most of it on the agenda, that I'm working on as far as the landscaping standards go. And I know you all saw the presentation, from last week or 2 weeks ago. And so, yeah, I think that's what we're doing now. What is it, Utah Water Conservation Forum Spring Conference is coming up, in April. So I don't know if anybody would be interested in attending that. May.
So I've attended that, or I've attended some things for the city in the past, at least one thing. And the discussion I had with, what was her name? Nice lady, was our first representative from the city. Come on, she was on our board for a little while.
Eve?
No,
Rosemary?
Eve.
Oh, Eve.
The discussion I had with Eve was that if the city would like me to attend something like that, that's fine. I sometimes have a tough time justifying my expenditures with the state of Utah Division of Environmental Quality, Division of Water Quality. And Eve's response to that was, they're throwing $2,000 at your position to the DEQ every year. And so you ought to be able to afford it, and I was able to sell it on that point. I don't know if the city's still doing that, and I don't know whether Lucy and the Department of Health have been working on that. I believe they still are. So it should be a budget item in there that pertains to my salary, which isn't a lot. It's not like they're sustaining me.
There is a virtual option this year.
There is a virtual option to this, so if we wanted to attend virtually, then there would be no cost associated with it.
I think so. There may be a registration fee, but they just sent out the pre-notice already, so.
So if there
Then there
was,
is a
if there
virtual
was a
option.
registration fee and the board member wanted to attend, would the city be able to pay for that?
It's a great question. I will find out.
Okay. There's a couple of conferences. There's the spring runoff conference out there too in April. Is that the same one you're talking about?
I don't think so.
The water seems to be the issue right now, and there seems to be more.
Funny that.
There seems to be more of these meetings than I care to discuss. But there was the spring runoff conference with Rosalind was going to present, and Jack Smith was going to present
Yeah,
too.
that's a different
That's a
one.
different-
Yeah, I
a
think that's a
different
different
one.
I don't think I'm going to attend that.
I'm gonna try, but I don't think I can.
I don't-
Timing is just wrong.
don't
I would
think-
like to, but
It's not, and then
Just a forecast of what they think is gonna come down?
no, it's more it's broader than that.
yeah.
I can find whatever I've gotten and email,
Yeah, that'd be
forward that to you.
interesting looking
And there's not a virtual component to that, is there?
I think there might be, because I think I remembered considering it and then I looked at my schedule and went, oh, that actually won't work, but yeah.
If there's a virtual component, to some extent, it makes sense to some of us to attend to, but then the other thing is that when I show up to these places in person, I make connections with people
Yeah.
that I don't.
Right,
But I've heard Jack Smith speak.
yeah. And I pretty much know what Jack's gonna probably say.
I don't, yeah. So I like Jack.
Oh, no, Jack's great.
I like the phrase, first things out of his mouth is, I have tenure. You know what that means to me, Steve?
He can say what he wants.
He can say whatever he wants.
Oh. Okay. Now I understand.
And he does.
Oh, boy. So I've got a couple things just to ask before we wrap up, if that's.
It's
For
good.
the next agenda, I was just thinking it would be great to make sure we have time for Steve, if there's been a Water Provider Alliance meeting, coalition, whatever it's called. It says in the agenda, it's called the Water Providers Alliance, but whatever. Whatever it is, that there could be some time for that. I think that's more of just a discussion item. I think it would be really awesome to have a discussion about what education and outreach plans and ideas the city has, because it keeps being alluded to, but we don't ever hear anything. And if there's any feedback wanted from us, or if you want us to stay out of it, that's fine. And then the last topic would be the fate of this board. I think would be really nice to have some kind of discussion about, and if that involves making sure that Carly's here, or making sure that there's some direction from the mayor, or whatever, I think it just would be nice to have something so that we then know, all right, are we then recruiting additional members? Like, what are we doing?
Is there anything else at this point in time? It's 2 months away. I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure we'll find
I'm
some
sure
other.
there'll be some other stuff that comes up, but those are just three things that struck me from our discussion today that would be really good to make sure we don't lose.
If they don't get to actually, if they get to a set of ordinances that the city wants to contemplate, it might be nice to throw a positive or a negative recommendation out on the exact ordinances that they come up with.
Or at least get a briefing on what's going on.
At least get a briefing on what's going on, and well, we try not to get into the weeds, as Cara likes to say.
I just don't want to hang out in All Day Eddie.
I know.
All Day Eddie can be great if you've got enough stuff on your boat, but if you don't have enough fun stuff on your boat, All Day Eddie really sucks.
So that being said, we might be talking about the landscaping ordinances again, okay?
And can I ask a follow-up question to the outreach and education? The really quick summary of that is that we've been waiting to have these standards developed before, and for some also watering information from USU, from Kelly Kopp, in northern Utah for a while before we put anything out. So we don't have any like specific plans in the works, but as far as your involvement, what would you prefer? You know, I mean, the staff would be happy to have help. but also don't want to overburden the water board. So, what kind of, what kind of input and involvement would you like to have?
I think we should start with a discussion, and I think, we've had involvement in the past that then didn't go anywhere, so the kind of involvement I'd like to have is not that. I think if there's potential to, if there's particular topics that you think are worth us discussing to help with or whatever, I think I would like to see it, because I would like to see it come from staff, whether that's you or whoever's going to be generating it, of what you would like from us, and then we can respond to that as opposed to the other way around, because I think in the past, suggestions have come from us and then they just kind of got tossed in the circular file. So I think at this point, consider it an invitation of tell us what you like, and how we could be helpful. And then, sure, we might, some other things in having discussions, we might come up with other ideas or other thoughts of like, oh wait, as we're talking about this, it would really make sense to do that. I think that's the piece to me that's kind of missing, is just the whole idea of having some discussions with some focus, but that allow for that moving around, because I think that's where the cool stuff comes out. That's actually interesting.
Great, so if I think by the next meeting, we should have at least some drafts put together, so if we bring those to you for discussion, okay, great.
That'd be great.
Cool, sounds good.
Is there any other items of interest that we need to discuss at this point in time?
Can I make a motion to adjourn?
You sure can. Do you want to come talk to Chuck?
You can always make a motion to adjourn.
You want to come talk to Chuck with me? Are you okay?
I would.
Let's go talk to Chuck.
Sorry, I can't join y'all.
That's okay.
Oh, look who's here.
What?
There's Chuck,
Oh, Chuck, we were going to invade your office.
and he looks thrilled.
Why don't you sit in the big chair?
Sit in the big room anyway, how's that?
I got you. The car's leaving.
I'm leaving, I'm sorry.
We had a couple
It's not you.
It doesn't feel that way, Carl, I'm just letting you know.
Ernie, do you need to officially adjourn the meeting?
Yeah, I thought I did.
Okay,
Just did.
okay.
And you can turn the
I heard Steve make a motion, I wasn't sure.
Yeah, you can turn the
Okay,
TV
great.
off.
And you can turn the TV off too if you would like, so I'm not on YouTube anymore.
And neither's Chuck.
I think Summer's gonna come down and turn us off.
Oh, and I'll be right back. There's another reason to come back.
Good to actually see you.